For those of you who don't know me, I'm Julie Wiscombe. I work for the Global Venture and Fellowship team, and I work with Theo Higgison and Liz Clark and a few other people, Sega, part of this team of teams of the fellow visits. We are really excited to have Sunil Abraham with us today. He's been in the office a little bit earlier this week, meeting with a few different people. I'll just give a really brief introduction, and I'll let him take it away. But Sunil is a classic social entrepreneur, and he doesn't just start one thing and stay on it. He keeps starting new things and cool ideas. He was elected into the fellowship in 1999, correct? For his work with, starts with an M, so let me say it wrong, Mahiti. Thanks, Sunil, appreciate that. He's now working as the executive director for the Center for Internet and Society. He does a lot of work providing affordable and effective services for the Indian voluntary sector through an online platform, so people can come together and offer pro bono services and fundraising and a lot of different things. And I'll let him explain more about his work with Mahiti and the work he's doing now and what he plans to do in the future. So those of you who are joining us on Google Hangout, welcome. We're trying this for the first time, so hopefully we won't have too many technical difficulties. Be sure that your mics are muted so we don't get any feedback. And with that, I'll turn the time over to Sunil.
So I'd like to start by thanking all my friends and colleagues here at Ashoka. It's thanks to your intervention very early in my career as a social entrepreneur that I've been able to do what I've been able to do. So thank you very much. I won't focus so much on Mahiti, the organization that I started perhaps now 14 years ago. It is an organization that tries to provide affordable and appropriate information and technology services to the nonprofit sector based on free software. And today, Mahiti is a rather large organization. About 70 engineers work at Mahiti, and they've managed to procure a building, and they don't really need me anymore. And perhaps they found my aggressive style of running organizations a bit too much. So I was asked perhaps to leave. So all they can stand of me these days is an occasional visit for their board meetings. But I was fortunate, again, 4 years ago, Indian billionaire called Anurag Dixit came to me with a check for $1 million and said, why don't you set up another organization? And he wanted that organization to be called the Center for Internet and Society, very much like the Berkman Center for Internet and Society, or the Stanford Center for Internet and Society, or the Nexa Center for Internet and Society. And I got started, and we have gotten going on some interesting projects, and I'd like to share some of those projects with you. Unfortunately, I've told my most interesting stories to Theodora as part of the FlipCam series. So I'm going to go down one notch and tell you perhaps slightly less interesting stories, but I hope you will find them enlightening and amusing. So the Center for Internet and Society is a policy research organization, and we focus on 5 areas of policy: accessibility by the disabled, reform of intellectual property law, openness, everything from free software, open standards, open data, all the way down to open educational resources, internet governance, mostly privacy and freedom of expression, and then telecom policy. So I'll start with internet governance, and I'll give you an idea of the type of project we do. In most countries, you have what is called an intermediary liability regime, or a safe harbor regime. Large companies like Google and Facebook have to have immunity from law because they have no idea what their users are using their platform for. And it's important for us to give these large intermediaries this immunity through properly designed law. Otherwise, there is a chilling effect on speech because these intermediaries constantly have to police their platforms to see if their users are doing anything illegal on these platforms. The trouble in India is our intermediary liability regime is very poorly designed. And if you look on news websites, you will see a lot of coverage about how India is increasingly trying to censor the internet. But on the other hand, you have large intermediaries like Google saying that we believe in internet liberty and we are protecting free speech online. So we decided to test this proposition. Is the intermediary liability regime in India having a chilling effect on free speech? That is the letter of the law. And when it comes to implementation of the law by these large intermediaries, are they doing a good job, as they promise to be doing, in protecting free speech online? So we started sending fraudulent takedown notices to 7 of the largest intermediaries in India, complaining about legitimate speech online, using nonsensical provisions in Indian law. But it was clear that even the so-called nonsensical provision did not apply to that particular type of speech that we were complaining about. And we found that in most cases, intermediaries overcomplied. They were happy to delete content. We would complain about a single comment at the bottom of a news article on a news website, and instead of deleting the single comment that we complained about, the intermediary would delete all 13. We would complain about 3 URLs that showed up in search engine results, and instead of deleting those 3 URLs from their search engine index, the intermediary would delete all 3,000. So we started pushing the bar, sending more and more ridiculous takedowns, till we reached a point where we got to an e-commerce website selling diapers, and we said, you must take down the product from your website because diapers are harmful to minors under Indian law, because diapers, as we all know, might cause diaper rash. And this was the only case when the intermediary pushed back and decided not to take down the content. So perhaps our overambitious conclusion from the research exercise is that intermediaries only worry about free speech when it undermines their bottom line. So it's up to us, ordinary citizens, to continue to fight the fight, because even though they might talk the talk, they don't necessarily walk the talk. So that's an example of a research project that we conducted when it comes to free speech. Now, the second area of work is intellectual property law reform. And as you all know, the balance between different stakeholders that have something to gain or lose from the intellectual property regime is tilted. There are 4 important stakeholders in that equation. The innovators producing new things, music or patents. The entrepreneurs that are taking those innovations to the market. Consumers, those purchasing those innovative things. And finally, the general public. Even though you might not purchase a book, perhaps as a student, you have an education exception that the law provides to you. And therefore, you also have a stake, even though you have nothing to do in terms of purchasing this particular piece of intellectual property. So we wanted to shake up intellectual property law quite dramatically. So we've come up with a project which is called the Islamic Critique of Intellectual Property Law. In Islamic law, there are 2 important components, banking law and contract law. And we want to understand how intellectual property, the current regime, does when we test these laws with Islamic principles. To begin with banking law, it is halal or lawful for you to charge rent on tangible property, like this office, for example. That is legitimate under Islamic law. It is haram or unlawful for you to charge rent on capital. This is called interest. Islamic law does not permit you to charge rent on capital. So the research question is it haram or halal lawful or unlawful for you to charge rent on intangible property? This is a question that we are placing before an Islamic legal scholar, and hopefully the research results will be available soon. And the second issue, Islamic contract law has equity baked inside. You cannot have unequal distribution of risk. Today, many of the contracts that authors enter into with publishers or musicians enter into with recording studios do not have these features. A very famous article that you should read on Slate is Courtney Love Does the Math. Courtney Love is the wife of Kurt Cobain. You won't assume that she knows much about the economics of the recording industry, but that's a useful article to read to understand how recording companies screw artists over. They make the artists bear almost all the risk for the venture that they're getting into together. So we're going to take contracts that authors sign with publishers and musicians sign with recording studios, and they're going to ask, are these contracts legal as per Islamic contract law? And I'm quite certain, at least in this case, that we will find that these contracts are not legal at all. And then our ambition is to go to the large Islamic banks that operate in the MENA region and also in Southeast Asia, in countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, and tell these banks that you do not invest in companies that produce pornography or produce alcohol or produce arms because you consider those activities haram. And from now, you must stop investing in companies that are using an intellectual property model that is not equitable. You should get them to fix their contracts. You should get them to embrace more equitable intellectual property practices. So this is how we are planning to influence and shake up the global thinking around intellectual property law. We are doing conventional things as well. And we go to the World Intellectual Property Organization, and we help developing country negotiators work out this balance in intellectual property law. Very important treaty that is being discussed at the World Intellectual Property Organization is the Treaty for the Visually Impaired. When publishers do not bother to make accessible versions of their works for the disabled, then the disabled must have a right, without asking the publishers for permission, to make the works accessible and to share it amongst themselves on a non-profit basis. We lobbied for this very hard in the Indian Copyright Act, and I'm happy to say that thanks to the effort of my organization and many other disability groups, we have a very robust exception for the disabled in Indian copyright law. It is disability neutral and also works neutral, unlike the Treaty for the Visually Impaired, which is disability specific, only those who are print impaired, and works specific, only for books. I'll move on to the third area, which is telecom policy. We do a lot of work around spectrum policy and backhaul. We want more sharing as far as spectrum is concerned, and more sharing as far as backhaul infrastructure is concerned. We want to drop prices for end consumers. India is really a telecommunication revolution. We have only 13 million broadband connections, but we have almost 700 million mobile phone connections, and this is a huge opportunity. But I'm going to tell you about a little more dangerous project that we are embarking on. We feel, especially when you work on policy, you have to constantly dance on this boundary between what is legal and what is illegal. Otherwise, you don't shake up the business sufficiently enough. Many of the phones sold in India are Chinese phones. They're very useful innovations. I'll describe just one of them to you. The Spice Popcorn M9000. It's a phone that's available in the Indian market for about $120. It has 2 SIM cards. It has an FM radio receiver. It has a receiver for terrestrial television. It comes with a Pica projector. It has loud boombox style inbuilt speakers. It ships with a tripod stand, external speakers, a torch, and a laser pointer. This is at the $150 marker. If you listen to David Drummond, the legal counsel of Google, he says there are 25,000 patents in the average smartphone. So you can imagine the Spice Popcorn M9000 might have 35,000 patents, and part of that research goes under the IP part of our research. We will be looking at 8 case studies in India and China, trying to understand how we can use options like patent pools and royalty caps to make it easier and to protect the production of innovation and the consumption of innovation at the bottom of the pyramid. But back to telecom. So what does this have to do with telecom? It's very expensive for mobile phone users to download movies onto their phones. So we thought that the last mile must be configured rather differently. You might request for a video file using an SMS or perhaps a GPRS. That is acceptable. But the download of the video file through GPRS would be very expensive, perhaps unaffordable to some of you as well. So, but these phones have, as I said before, receivers for terrestrial television. So the garage below my office has been converted to a hackerspace. Hackers have been invited in, lured in, using mostly coffee and cake. I wish we could afford beer, but we can't. And they're working on what is called a pirate television station. We're trying to build a television station. Everybody has built a pirate radio station, so that's boring. We are stepping up the bar. So it's a pirate television station below the $500 mark. And hopefully with this complex system worked out that you make a request using SMS or GPRS, the file is downloaded from the internet, cached onto some kind of server, and then using the $500 television station, a slum or a village can have its own television station. So this is another research project. Of course, the moment we start broadcasting, we'll get arrested, so we'll do it very carefully. In front of, we're planning to go to Delhi and sit in front of bureaucrats and break the law right in front of their eyes so that they take it a little gently. And then hopefully convince them that they have to think about dramatic changes to the way the spectrum is managed in the country and the way we regulate those who broadcast on spectrum. Moving on to privacy. So one of India's richest man, Nandan Nilekani, a real entrepreneur, not a fake one like me, he has now joined government, and he's heading what is called the UID project. The UID project is a centralized, biometric-based identity management and authentication management project for the whole country. So obviously, there are some problems here because you have to ask the question, perhaps you ask the question here, what would Jesus do? I've seen that t-shirt. But in India, that question becomes, what would Gandhi do? Right? Because most of us are not Christians. Christians are a very small minority. So Gandhi would never support centralization. Absolutely not, because he was a security geek. Gandhi totally understood that if you put all your secrets in one place, then it would be very easy for somebody to hack into that one place and download the biometrics of the whole nation, just like they did in Israel. And then they leaked the biometrics of the whole nation onto the internet. So Nandan Nilekani, even though he is a billionaire, doesn't seem to understand security. So we need a research organization to help him think through some of this and build a robust critique of the project. There are other people critiquing the project, but they're comparing it to Nazi Germany, and that's a bit too much, you know. You can't get so shrill, and then people stop listening to you. So we have written 7 open letters to the committee that was examining the UID bill, explaining to them, yes, indeed, we need identity management, of course. Yes, indeed, we need an authentication system in the country. These are useful things. But there is an appropriate place for biometrics. And this does not have to be centralized. It should be based on the technology of the internet. The internet is decentralized, and still there is security and identity management, and this works perfectly. Just imagine if we had a law which said, regardless of whether you're using Hotmail or regardless if you're using Yahoo, all of you must store your passwords in a single place. That's what your fingerprint is. Your fingerprint is your password. That would be a stupid law. But just imagine we passed a law in Washington and said, all citizens of Washington, their keys to their offices and their keys to their homes must be stored at the local police station. This is what we want to do to raise the security of the city. That's a stupid idea, because that does not make the city more secure. In fact, it makes the city less secure. So we have to come up with explanations and research to explain to these people to correct course, because billions of dollars are being pumped down this project. And it will be a waste of money if, like the UK, in 5 years' time we have to cancel the project. It's better to get the project right the first time around. So we tell them stories. That's a good way to start. Scenario building is a legitimate research exercise. Policy sting operations is a legitimate research exercise, and scenario building is as well. Imagine Theodora is a banker, and I'm a corrupt Indian who has black money, money for which I'm not paying taxes, and I want to put it in Theodora's bank. And Theodora is a very ambitious bank manager, and she's trying to get maximum deposits. So she's also a little bit shaky ethically. So Theodora invites me into her bank, and she says, let's make your legitimate bank account, and she harvests my fingerprints and then sends it up to the UID database. A deduplication algorithm is run, and it determines that I'm unique in the database, and it assigns me a unique identity number. And then I open my legal bank account. And then Theodora says, I'll put my right hand, and you put your left hand. And then we send another set of biometrics up the pipe, and the deduplication engine runs one more time. And again, it's a unique combination of biometrics, and another unique identity number is generated, and I use that number to open my black money account. So we demonstrate that they're very simple hacks. Of course, Theodora could get a little more sophisticated. Biometrics are, after all, images the moment they hit a computer. She could have a Photoshop filter type thing that makes 4 or 5 standard variations on my biometrics. And then I could open 5 or 6 accounts. So we prove that biometrics works at the US border because everybody is under surveillance. The immigration officer that is harvesting my biometrics, or that is checking my biometrics, and me, the citizen that is providing my biometrics, are both under surveillance all the time. And that is why we can trust the use of biometrics at the US border. If this was happening behind closed doors, you'd have no idea what is going on, especially in the offices of private organizations like banks. So we're trying to build a robust critique. We're trying to save money. My donor gives me only $1 million, but I use that $1 million to influence the spending of billions of dollars so that we save money, which is taxpayers' money for all of us. And finally, between the Center for Internet and Society and Mahiti, that's the years 2004 and 2007, I was very fortunate to get a job at the UNDP, at the International Open Source Network. It was a small project of the UNDP. And we programmed in 42 countries, from Iran to Fiji. We went from country to country promoting the use of free software and open standards policies, asking for the government to enact national policies. And this often led to large savings in e-governance projects. So I helped the Moldovan government, for example, author their open standards policy. I've helped the government of Saudi Arabia set up the National Center for Free and Open Source Technologies. And most recently, just 3 months ago, I helped the government of Iraq produce what they call Government Interoperability Framework, and also their National Enterprise Architecture. These are open standards policies. It helps the government work more efficiently, more securely. Openness has a close connection to security. If we don't know what is in these machines, then how do we know we can trust them? There's a famous story from an American court. A gentleman was caught driving under the influence of alcohol, and the prosecutors presented a report from the breath analyzer, and the judge said, how can I trust that? Can I have the source code of that breath analyzer? Because this is technology that impinges on the rights of a citizen. And the manufacturers of the breath analyzer said, no, we can't give that to you, it's a trade secret. And the judge said, then I'm throwing out that bit of evidence. So you can see that openness is critical in government technology, especially when civil liberties are concerned. So whenever I get some support from UNDP or a foreign government invites me, because my donors' money is mostly for our work in India, I go and try and help foreign governments as well think through some of these ideas. So thank you very much for patiently listening to my nonsense, and if you have some questions, I'd be happy to respond. Do we have time for questions at all?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Do you know if you're like fraudulent takedown test? Has anyone tried that in the United States? Because I think that would have very similar results here.
I think the takedown regime in the US is different because it is for copyrighted works. Our takedown regime was mostly for non-copyrighted works, political speech, etc. And if you look at the Google transparency reports, maximum amount of takedowns in India is for political speech, criticism of bureaucrats and politicians. That's a tragedy in so-called the world's largest democracy. I'm suspecting that in the US there is already a chilling effect. Berkman Center has set up a website called chillingeffect.org. But I also suspect that in the US regime there is a penalty for sending fraudulent takedown notices. So you cannot repeat the research exercise here. The policy sting operation can only be repeated in jurisdictions where there is no penalty for abusing the takedown notice system. So one of our recommendations in terms of fixing the regime is not that we don't want an intermediary liability regime. We want one that works. And one of our recommendations to fix it is that you must have penalties. Maybe a 3 strikes rule. You send 3 fraudulent takedowns. So Sony sends 3 fraudulent takedowns. They complain about a baby dancing to Prince's Let's Go Crazy. That is unacceptable. If they do that 3 times, they shouldn't be allowed to send takedowns for 1 year. And that will teach them to be more careful when they send takedowns. There is analysis in the Sopa Pipa opposition in the US. Rights holders have sent takedowns to get criticism of Sopa Pipa taken down, pretending that it is IP infringement. So they just pack takedowns with whatever they want. An average takedown has thousands of URLs. And we suspect that the rights holder, that the intermediary, the large intermediaries, their best lawyers are saved for their mergers and acquisitions and acquiring patent portfolios. And the guys looking at the takedowns are interns from law schools. So they don't give a damn. They're just looking forward to the next beer. So they're happy to comply. Yes?
In the story you told us about the UID
Yes.
research that you're doing, the example was one of showing them that the technology was flawed and could be prone to fraud.
Yes.
What are you finding in terms of how are you trying to make the argument that there's a real risk in terms of protecting people's privacy in using a system like this beyond the
Yes.
fraud risk?
Yes.
And how are you thinking about sort of activating the latent demand that potentially citizens have around protecting their privacy, but that isn't necessarily being manifested in a way that is pushing
Yes.
any industry to
Yes.
protect that?
Before I answer the question, I should also add that thanks to our really loud opposition to the UID project, the government has now invited us onto a committee that is producing the white paper before the draft privacy bill in India is written. It's the process preceding the drafting of the bill. So thanks to a large intrusive project such as the UID, the government seems increasingly obliged to start finally working on getting a horizontal statute for privacy protection in India. There is some amount of protection in vertical statutes for each sector, like finance and health, etc. The privacy concerns emerge because of the centralized nature of the system. If the authentication system is based on biometrics, then the state has to hold the biometrics of all citizens. And citizens cannot hold biometrics perhaps of state officials. That is not possible. And every time a citizen wants to authenticate himself or herself, the authentication process goes through the centralized server. And even though the UID officials deny it, it's almost obvious that they're going to have some kind of log. And if somebody has a 360 view of the log files, they'll be able to tell what you're up to. And that's the real surveillance danger in the design of the project. Now suppose we move this to digital signatures. The whole project is based on digital signatures like Estonia and not biometrics. In that case, the state can hold the digital signatures, the public key of citizens, and citizens can choose to hold the public keys of those officials that they deal with. The authentication between two digital signatures doesn't need centralized infrastructure at all. We can both authenticate. When I authenticate mail from you and you authenticate encrypted mail from me, you're ensuring that it's from the right person. There's no log of that in any centralized system. That authentication process is happening on my computer. I'm checking on my computer whether your signature on your email is really yours. That processing happens on my computer. So the moment you remove biometrics from the equation, the centralized nature of the authentication system collapses. And then there is no centralized audit trail for transactions in the system. Secondly, it allows the citizen to have an audit trail as well, which was not possible in the previous case. Because I will then ask you to sign the document. And so the power relationship, the asymmetric power relationship, they're trying to build some equity into that as well. So citizens can hold the state also accountable. So many areas of technology, we cannot apply policy band-aid. We can't get the technology wrong. We can't get the design of the technology wrong, and then hope we can fix it with policy afterthoughts. That's not going to happen. You have to fix the technological design first, and then we can have some additional legal safeguards. But the law cannot fix what is wrong with the code. I hope I... Yes, please.
Can you tell us a little bit more about your personal background and what inspired you to do this work?
That's complicated. I don't think my life my career path or career trajectory was not very clear to me. And when I reached college, it got even more hazy. Between the bus stop where we got off and my engineering school, there were a whole series of bars on the left. So I used to be able to avoid the first and second one, but by the time I got to the fourth bar, I was in it, and so I had 15% of attendance in the final year of engineering, and I don't know how I managed to secure an engineering degree. But I've always been forced into social entrepreneurship. I went around trying to get a job because I had an industrial production engineering degree, and nobody would give me a job because Bangalore is not a city with factories. So because my dad worked for the voluntary sector, I thought maybe the voluntary sector will want me. So I asked a gentleman called Pradeep, who worked at the large voluntary sector organization operating in North Karnataka called Samuha. And he asked me, have you heard of the internet? I said, yes. He said, do you know how to use it? I said, no. He said, are you willing to learn if I give you an opportunity? This is the question he asked me, and I said, yes. So he gave me this job, and he helped me buy my first modem. I connected to the internet, began to learn about the internet myself. And then 3 years later, he said, oh, we've had enough of you. We're going to throw you out, and you have to set up an organization. We'll give you a small amount of initial money so that you can keep it going for a couple of years. And the name of your organization is going to be Mahiti, and you're going to head this new organization. So on both occasions, the second time and the first time, I was forced to be a social entrepreneur. I was thrown kicking and screaming out into social entrepreneurship. But then I made of it what I did. So I don't think there is anything unique to what I am that allows me to do what I do. It's just that I've been blessed to be always in the right place and to have people that will trust me with the task of social entrepreneurship. So maybe I failed a particular criterion on the Ashoka test, but this is the honest truth, if I may.
Are there any questions on the Hangout?
Looks like only one other person on there.
Yeah, Sunil, I've got a question.
Yes, please.
Hello? Everything you've talked about today suggests that information policy and enforcement has to happen at the country level. And I wonder, what is the prospect for global standards, global policy, global entrepreneurship against information challenges and enforcement?
So if you look at the news these days, you will see reports that say that the UN is trying to take over the governance of the internet. You'll hear two stories. The first is that the International Telecommunication Union wants to update its treaty and include internet governance as part of its mandate. That's very scary because the ITU is a part of the UN, a UN body, where there's little participation for civil society, unlike WIPO and World Health Organization, etc. There's very little scope for civil society organizations to participate in the processes, the policy formulation at the International Telecommunication Union. And then you hear a second proposal from the Indian government, which is called the Committee for Internet-Related Policy, CIRP. And on the face of it, if you read the text of the proposal, it seems okay. There's a lot of so-called commitment to multi-stakeholder participation. So all stakeholders, and on the internet that means the technical community, the academic community, civil society, the government, and the private sector, because where would the internet be if you didn't have the private sector? But people who read this particular proposal from the Indian government are very suspicious because the Indian government is doing all sorts of nasty things within India as far as the internet is concerned. John Doe orders that are blocking many websites. A recent John Doe order against an anonymous party was used to block Pastebin, saying that Pastebin could be used as a location to download movies. Anybody who's been to Pastebin will know that you can't download a movie from Pastebin. So people, even though they might be slightly comfortable with what are some of the ideas being proposed by the Indian government, are very scared because they feel that the Indian government is not really implementing multi-stakeholder consultation within its own territory, and it's not really protecting civil liberties within its own territory. So perhaps the other thing to say here is the internet has worked rather well without regulation. And regulation per se is not always the solution. If something is not broken, then why attempt to fix it? Just let it be. So I think to some degree the question is answered by saying we should be aware of those bits of the internet that we should leave deregulated, that we should allow different stakers to make of it what they will. But there are serious concerns around, say, privacy or protection of children. And in many of those areas, we need cooperation. For matters connected to intellectual property rights, we have the World Intellectual Property Organization. And increasingly, there is some balance. Negotiators from the South are able to push back because rights holders sometimes try to dominate the discussion and drive the agenda. So negotiators from the South are able to increasingly push back. And we are part of that pushback. With privacy, there is an annual conference of privacy commissioners. And privacy commissioners are doing an excellent job, especially the Canadian privacy commissioners and some of the European privacy commissioners. And perhaps there, in terms of harmonization of policy, maybe a little more formal structure or process is necessary. So there is indeed a case to be made that there is some amount of policy vacuum and some amount of harmonization is necessary. But we shouldn't do an overkill. There needs to be a balance of deregulated, free internet and the minimum amount of policy formulation and harmonization, especially if we are investigating a child pornography case, then it's important that we have quick cooperation between jurisdictions so that arrests are made. But if, for example, we move to a different area, like there is a protester in Tahrir Square, he might be breaking or she might be breaking Egyptian law as of that moment, but that shouldn't necessarily count as an international crime. And we don't need BlackBerry to support the old Egyptian government with interception on BlackBerry traffic like they do for, say, Canadian traffic or Europe. All BlackBerry traffic from the developing world at least goes through network operating centers in Canada and America and other parts of the world. So it's possible to intercept the traffic there. And we wouldn't want that excuse saying that we're helping with investigation of offenses to be used by an authoritarian regime to ask for greater cooperation across jurisdictions. So we need to strike a right balance, because what is considered lawful and unlawful is still not the same. To use very old technology, dog meat is legal in China, illegal. You can't set up a restaurant selling dog meat in Washington, D.C. In Delhi, you can't buy beef. There's a new law proposed in my state which says that possession of beef will be punishable with a 6-month jail term. It's a complicated thing. To some degree, these differences across jurisdictions are useful. I can go to China and eat dog meat, for example. But in some cases, those differences are horrifying, and therefore we need some harmonization. So it's a very difficult question to answer. It's something that we are all wondering about, and I don't think any of us have good answers to your question. But it doesn't mean we should stop trying just because it's a difficult problem. I hope that answered your question.
Okay, do we have any last questions?
What brings you to DC?
There's a Google at Liberty conference, and they asked me to speak to what do you want the U.S. government and U.S. corporations to do to protect liberty online. So I said that I'm not sure, but I find it rather distasteful that we refer to these corporations as U.S. corporations, because they're so full of Indians. But I came up with a hijacker-style list of demands for what the U.S. government should do, and I read it out yesterday. And all the members on my, all the other opponents in my debate seem to agree with me. So I think maybe there is a hope that some of these demands, there will be a video up shortly of my intervention on that panel.
What were the big three, the demands?
Sorry?
What were the biggest 3 demands you have?
I have to look at my notes, but the first one was saying that the U.S. government must recognize that access to knowledge is part of freedom of expression. Those are not two different things. If the U.S. government pursues aggressive enforcement of imbalanced and outdated intellectual property law, and at the same time tries to champion internet freedom globally, they sound like hypocrites. They have to somehow harmonize those two positions. The second was the U.S. government must appreciate the anxieties of developing countries. How does the U.S. government deal with the anxiety around backdoors in Chinese telecommunication equipment? It deals with that anxiety by banning the use of Chinese telecommunication equipment in the U.S. jurisdiction. But that's not a tenable solution for Africans or for Indian governments. And nor do we know that we can trust the US telecommunication gear or the Scandinavian telecommunication gear. Those pieces of equipment have to increasingly become transparent. Because without transparency, there is no way one can reasonably say, or say for sure, that there are no backdoors. Backdoors are bad in every sense. I can understand legal interception technology, but a backdoor that we don't know about it is a huge security risk. So that's the second suggestion. The third one, I had 6, but I'll just stop at the third one. The third one is don't be too instrumental in your interventions, because that undermines the credibility, the local credibility of those you're trying to help. I had a phone call from the US Embassy, and the woman said, Mr. Abraham, we'd like to invite you to the US on a freedom of expression fellowship, and you'll get to meet bureaucrats and politicians and business leaders, and this will be a useful thing to you, and you'll get to explain your point of view. So I said, I already travel so much that I'll get into trouble with my home ministry. I'll have to get clearance from my home ministry. My wife already thinks that I travel so much, so we have a small daughter, so every travel has to be approved by her. And the woman said, the woman said, oh, that's no problem. We'll buy a ticket for your wife and daughter as well. And I said, that's an unacceptable proposal, because the word gets around that Sunil Abraham, who hosts Google Policy Fellows, funded by Anurag Dixit, Mr. Partypoker.com, who had Ruth Parasol, one of the US's most foremost porn baronesses, as his business partner in Partypoker.com, also funded by the US government, who takes him on junkets to the US. That undermines my local credibility to fight for free speech in India. So if the US government has to support my organization, they have to give me core funding, which is untied. They have to allow me to criticize their intellectual property policies with the very same funding that I will use to defend free speech. So this is the third suggestion. I'll stop here. The hijacker's list is rather boring.
Okay, well, we just want to thank Sunil for coming.
Thanks for having me.
And if you're interested in connecting with him, then please feel free to follow him on the Ashoka Hub. Thanks, guys.